the Medici.
Chapter 3. Giovanni di Bicci.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
Giovanni di Bicci, born 1360, died 1428. In the year 1400, the Medici were an ordinary middle-class family in Florence. The family can be traced back as far as the year 1201, when Chiarissimo, eldest son of Giambuono de Medici and a member of the town council, is noted as being the owner of various houses and towers in the Mercato Vecchio. But the only branch of it with which we are concerned is that which made so great a name in history, and was destined to run an eventful course of nearly 350 years. Of this branch, Giovanni de Medici was at this time the head. For some reason or other, his father, Everardo de Medici, was nicknamed by his companions Bicci. Among the Medici, the same Christian names recur so frequently that each is in history known by some addition or sobriquet, and Giovanni, the founder of the historic branch of the family, is always known as Giovanni de Bicci, i.e. Giovanni, the son of Bicci. He was at this time a man of 40 years of age, and highly respected for his character and business ability. The family were bankers and already possessed of considerable wealth, which Giovanni by his financial ability increased. Several of his ancestors had taken part in public affairs. His great-grandfather, Everardo, who had begun the prosperity of the family by successful trading operations, had been gonfaloniere in 1314. His grandfather, Salvestro, had been one of the envoys of the Republic, deputed to conclude the treaty with Venice in 1336, and two of his father's first cousins had been gonfaloniere in, respectively, 1349 and 1354. But Giovanni de Bicci de Medici came of a family which had signalised themselves in another way than this, for they had on several occasions taken a prominent part in the struggles of the people against the nobles, grandi. A distant cousin of his father, also named Giovanni, had in 1343 been seized and put to death by the tyrant of Florence, Walter de Brienne, Duke of Athens, as one of the most dangerous of the citizens, popolani. And when Giovanni de Bicci was 18 years old, he had seen in 1378 a distant cousin of his grandfather, another Salvestro, by his powerful words in the Signoria, bring about the riot known as that of the Ciompi, the weavers, dyers, and minor workmen of the Guild of Wool, which riot, we are told, broke the power of the nobles and destroyed the oligarchy of the parte Guelfa, while another cousin of his father's, Vieri, had pacified the rebellion of 1393. Thus the family had as its tradition antagonism to the nobles and championship of the cause of the people. Giovanni de Bicci was destined to go far in the same course, as well as to found a family whose influence was to spread far beyond the sphere of the petty politics of Florence. Let us first see what, in this year 1400, were the conditions surrounding him, 1, in his own city, and 2, in the larger world beyond it. 1. Florence, after fierce struggles between rival factions for 150 years, had at last settled down with the most democratic government on record. In 1260, the banished Ghibellines, under Farinata degli Uberti, had at the Battle of Monteaperto defeated the Guelphs and re-entered Florence in triumph. The Ghibellines had thereupon proposed to raze Florence to the ground. Against this, Farinata degli Uberti had raised his single voice and prevailed, for which act he has obtained lasting honour in Florence, and his statue, the only Ghibelline one, has received a place among those of Florence's greatest men in the Uffizi colonnade. Then had succeeded in 1289 the Battle of Campaldino, giving the final victory to the Guelphs, whereupon the community had been divided into guilds, arti, whose representatives formed the governing body, the Signoria. In 1298 had begun the building of the cathedral, and of the Palazzo della Signoria, the order for the latter to Arnolfo di Cambio, the architect, stating that it was required for the greater security of the Signoria in this city, so given to sudden and violent tumults. But the internecine strifes did not cease, even though the Ghibellines had been driven out. The same fierce conflicts as before broke out under new names: Cerci versus Donati, White Guelphs versus Black Guelphs, and so on. At length, in 1343, Walter de Brienne, a foreigner whom the city had made its governor, was driven out, when a time of anarchy and frequent revolutions followed, during which occurred, in 1348, the Great Plague described by Boccaccio, and in 1378, the above-mentioned riot of the Ciompi. As a result, the Signoria was reconstituted and composed of representatives, priors, from each of the 21 guilds, instead of from the more important ones only. These were directed to be chosen every 2 months, afterwards extended to a longer period, while it was ruled that no noble should be eligible as a member of the Signoria. The president of the latter body was the Gonfaloniere, chosen from among the members of the Signoria, and elected for a similar short period. Nor did even this satisfy Florence's fiercely democratic instincts. Although all power was vested in the representatives of the various guilds, yet on any large question the great bell, the vacca, in the tower of the Palazzo della Signoria, summoned the whole male population into the square below, when the question was decided, ostensibly at any rate, by popular acclamation. This form of government continued for 150 years. It had been established about 20 years at the time our story begins. Passionately indeed was Florence enamoured of freedom. In a struggle of some 200 years, she had first gradually shaken herself free from subordination to the emperors, then fought against and thrown off the power of the nobles, and lastly had established the most republican republic the world has ever seen. And in deep dread of being brought again under the yoke, she had developed so great a jealousy of any action, either by an individual or a family, tending, however remotely, to threaten her independence, that this feeling had become a mania. There was a very short shrift in Florence for anyone suspected of harbouring an intention of exalting himself into any position of authority above that of an ordinary citizen. Florence was at this time at a high level of power, ruling over various subject cities and constantly increasing her territory by little wars with neighbouring states. Republics such as Florence were of a peculiar kind, since only the citizens of the capital city possessed any political power. None others were allowed any voice in the policy of the state. This complete subjection to the capital city accounts for the fierce struggles of Pisa, Prato, Pistoia, Volterra, and other cities gradually conquered by Florence, against being subdued by her. It is also, no doubt, the reason why history at this period always speaks of Florence to denote that state which at a later period we speak of as Tuscany. As regards trade and commerce, Florence was at this time the most flourishing state in Europe. Her citizens owned banks in all countries, and the golden florin had become the general European standard of value, marking the leading position in commerce held by Florence. Macaulay, speaking of the revenue about this time, says, quote, "The revenue of the Republic amounted to 300,000 florins, a sum which, allowing for the depreciation of the precious metals, was at least equivalent to 600,000 pounds sterling, a larger sum than England and Ireland, 2 centuries later, yielded to Elizabeth. The chief trade was in wool and woolen cloth, both that produced by Florence itself and that sent there from other countries, to be dyed and refined by a secret process and re-exported. A trade memorialised in the still existing names of 2 celebrated streets in Florence, Calimera, or Calimara, and the Pellicceria. And the Guild of the Wool Merchants was the most important in Florence, so much so that to this guild was committed the work of building the cathedral. The principal part of the trade of Florence was with England. 2. Turning now to the larger world outside Florence, we find the other states in Europe situated as follows. Venice, a republic of a very different kind and ruled by an oligarchy of nobles, was rapidly advancing to the height of her power, having in 1380 crushed her maritime rival Genoa, and was year by year extending her territories by fresh conquests. Milan, an imperial duchy, was under the rule of her great duke, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, the most capable of that family, the builder of the Cathedral of Milan and the Certosa of Pavia. He had conquered almost all northern Italy, extending his dominions even as far as Perugia and Spoleto, was at this time only resisted by Florence, and was in full expectation of shortly subduing Florence also, when he would make himself king of Italy. Naples and Sicily, a kingdom, but of the feeblest kind, was in its usual state of anarchy, the bone of contention between the rival houses of Anjou and Aragon, as it had been for 150 years. The papacy. The situation of the papacy at this time was most deplorable. There had in 1378 begun the Great Schism, with rival popes at Avignon and Rome, a state of things which had brought down the papacy to the very dust, for there was here no case of an anti-pope. Both popes had been duly elected, and each had an equal right to be considered the true pope. On the side of the French pope were France, Scotland, Spain, Portugal, Savoy, and Lorraine. On the side of the Italian pope were England, Germany, Italy, Denmark, Sweden, and Poland. Whereas salvation was held to depend on being in communion with the true pope, none during all this period could feel sure that he was so, while it was at any rate certain that one half of Europe was not. The position was intolerable, and its results during the 40 years it lasted were such as to degrade the papacy to the utmost depth of humiliation. As regards the remaining countries of Europe, in England Henry IV had just usurped the kingdom from Richard II, whom he had murdered. In France, Charles VI was king, but was mad and the country in the greatest disorder. Germany was a mass of insignificant states, and the emperor almost a cipher, the 7 princely electors invariably choosing as emperor some prince of small dominions and power, who would be unable to oppose their own assumption of independence. In the Eastern Empire, Constantinople was being closely pressed by the Ottoman Turks. Spain was not as yet one country, Aragon and Castile being still petty independent kingdoms, while all the southern half of Spain was held by the Saracens, or, as they were called, the Moors. The above is an outline of the general state of Europe before those great changes began, in which the Medici were to play so large a part. The Florence in which Giovanni de Bicci passed his life, though very different in aspect from that with which we are acquainted, nevertheless contained a good deal which we should still recognise. The baptistery, then already many hundred years old, was much the same as now. So also the Bargello, built about 150 years before this time, and close to it the Bardia, built in 1330. The Palazzo della Signoria, known to us as the Palazzo Vecchio, built in 1298, was, as to the front portion, much as we see it, but did not extend at the back down the Via de' Gondi, while along the front ran a raised platform, the ringhiera, from which proclamations were made. The Loggia dei Lanzi had lately been completed. The cathedral, which had been building for over 100 years, was still unfinished, and its great dome had not even been begun, while many doubted whether so vast a space could ever be covered in this way. Its beautiful campanile, Giotto's tower, was finished. The Ponte Vecchio, with its shops, though not then jewellers' shops, was as now, except, of course, for the passaggio on the roof of the shops, constructed long afterwards. Of the two chief churches, Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella, the latter was completed, except for its facade, while Santa Croce was approaching completion. The city was surrounded by its ancient and picturesque walls, which are now gone, but its main streets still follow the same course as then, and many of them present much the same general appearance. Or San Michele, the curious square church, built by the Guild of the Wool Merchants, was nearly finished, and behind it stood, as now, the guild house of this celebrated Arte della Lana. As we look at this old house of the great Guild of Wool, with their emblem of the lamb over the door, and think of the many works in which this guild were then occupied in Florence, we cannot but be impressed with the thought of how many other things besides money-making engaged the attention of this enlightened body of merchants, and of how much in Florence's after-glory has had its birth in that now little noticed old building. And it was in connection with these things that a movement was about to begin which was soon to be the paramount question in Florence. For in our review of the Florence of 1400, we have also to think of the existing state of things in regard to art and learning. These, though in the previous century roused from their long sleep by Dante, Giotto, and Petrarch, appeared to have sunk back again into slumber. Dante, whose swan-like dirge of the departing Middle Ages had inspired all mankind for a time, had died 80 years before, and no successor to him had arisen. Giotto, the shepherd boy whose kiss had aroused the sleeping beauty, Art, from her 9 centuries of slumber in her Byzantine palace, had died 63 years before. His great pupil, Orcagna, had died 32 years before, and the painters of the time, the Giotteschi, had no idea beyond that of a slavish copying of Giotto, and so had sunk into a conventionalism almost as complete as that Byzantine tradition from which Giotto had rescued art. Lastly, Petrarch, the great scholar who had led men to study the long-buried writings of the classic age, had passed away 26 years before, and no other like him had arisen. Thus, when the year 1400 dawned, it seemed as though the movement which had begun in the time of Dante and Giotto was merely a passing phase, already moribund, if not defunct. It was, however, not so. There was soon to be a fresh movement destined far to surpass all that had gone before, and the latter half of Giovanni de Bicci's life, with which we have to do, the period from 1400 to 1428, is the time of this morning of the Renaissance, of that extraordinary outburst of art in every branch, which, felt in some degree in other cities of Italy also at this time, seemed in Florence to permeate the whole people with its throbbing life, producing results, the influence of which was, before another 100 years were over, to be felt to the utmost bounds of Europe. Giovanni di Bicci, with his wife, Piccarda Boeri, and his two sons, Cosimo and Lorenzo, who in the year 1400 were boys of 11 and 5, lived first in an old house in the Via Larga, and then in one which still stands in the Piazza del Duomo, and the familiar view which daily met Giovanni's eye from the windows of his house must have been that of the slowly rising walls and dome of the cathedral, begun so long before, and intended by Florence to be grander than any yet built. By the year 1400, Giovanni de Bicci was a man in middle age, gracious in manner, retiring in disposition, and much respected by all around him. He has received very little notice from historians, but he was the author of various important works for the benefit of his countrymen and for the encouragement of art. He was distinguished for his ability as a financier and for his prudence, the quality always specially admired by the Florentines, and had made himself highly popular with the people by the liberal way in which he spent his wealth for the public benefit, and by his constant readiness to be their champion in the never-ceasing struggle against the nobles. Being regardless of fame or notoriety, it is only here and there in the history of the time that notice of him is to be found. Moreover, during his lifetime, the chief influence in Florence was possessed by the Albizzi family, who, notwithstanding the law affecting the nobles, managed, chiefly by influencing the elections, still to exercise power. Meanwhile, Giovanni was laying the foundations of a family which was ere long to obliterate all memory of the sway of the Albizzi. The first occasion when we find him specially mentioned is in the year 1401. In the picture of the Florence of that age, one point has still to be noted, without which that picture would not be complete, namely the terrible outbreaks of the plague, which again and again devastated the city in those days, keeping the thought of death and the hereafter ever present in the minds of all men. And our story opens in the midst of one of these awful visitations. And again, as in 1348 and so many other occasions, large numbers of all classes were being daily carried off by this terrible disease. In this distress, Florence determined on a costly votive offering to be placed in her oldest and most highly venerated church, San Giovanni Battista, better known as the Baptistery, and that this offering should take the form of 2 pairs of very elaborate bronze doors. An international competition was instituted to settle who should execute this work, and Giovanni de Bicci, as a leading citizen and a great patron of art, was appointed one of the judges in this competition. It is an interesting and significant coincidence that the first mention we have of the first of the Medici should be his taking a prominent part in an event which has always been held as the birthday of the Renaissance in art. During the next 17 years, 1402 to 1418, the chief notices which we have of Giovanni are those showing his quiet but steady advancement in public affairs. In 1402, we find him elected by his guild, that of the bankers, Arte del Cambio, as its prior, which made him a member of the government. And we find him again thus elected in 1408 and in 1411. It is specially recorded that he kept aloof from the many political intrigues of the time, and that these and subsequent higher honours were forced upon him unsought. In 1417, Florence suffered another of those terrible visitations of the plague which afflicted her on so many occasions. This time it carried off 16,000 of the inhabitants. Giovanni did his utmost to relieve the many sufferings of the people, while we are told that he did not confine his help only to the poor, but was no less ready to alleviate the misfortunes of the rich. We must now glance at what had been going on in Europe during those 18 years. Contemporary historical events, 1400 to 1418. The first 18 years of the 15th century were years of various great events in Europe, all of which closely affected Florence and its Signoria. In 1400, the Emperor Wenceslaus was deposed by the electors for his worthless, savage, and drunken character. In his place they chose Rupert, Count Palatine of the Rhine. In 1401, the Turks, under Bajazet, having at last come to the final stage of the long campaign of centuries against the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and having reached and begun to besiege the capital itself, Constantinople, the Eastern Emperor, Manuel Palaeologus, who had in 1391 succeeded his father, John Palaeologus, John VI, like him visited Italy, Germany, France, and England to try to rouse them to aid in saving Constantinople and to prevent such a dire calamity to all Europe as its fall into the hands of the Turks. He was received everywhere with imperial honours and much sympathy, but as regards Italy, the papacy was paralysed by the Great Schism, and also would do nothing unless the Eastern Church would agree to acknowledge the supremacy of the Church of Rome, while the other Italian states were at almost constant war and threatened at the moment with extinction by Milan. Germany was in chaos, the emperor having just been deposed. In France, the king was out of his mind, and the country in the utmost confusion. And in England, the king was a usurper, threatened with civil war. So the Emperor Manuel Palaeologus had to return as unsuccessful as his father had been. Help, however, came to Constantinople from an unexpected quarter. The Turkish dominions were suddenly invaded by the Tartars under Timur, or Tamerlane, which called away the Sultan Bajazet from his attack on Constantinople. And at the Battle of Angora in the following year, he was defeated and taken prisoner by Timur. This defeat shattered for a time the power of the Ottoman Turks and gave Constantinople a last lease of life for another 50 years. In 1402, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, Duke of Milan, suddenly died in the midst of his schemes of conquest, relieving Florence of her most formidable enemy and enabling her 4 years later to conquer and annex a part of his dominions, Pisa. This conquest of Pisa extended Florence's territory to the coast and gave her a seaport. In 1409, in Florence's new subject city, took place the Council of Pisa. The effects of the Great Schism, with half the countries of Europe recognising one pope and the other half another, became at length so intolerable that all Europe began to cry out for a reformation of the Church in head and members, a phrase constantly on men's lips all through this 15th century, and this was the first of 3 attempts to that end. The cardinals of both the rival parties deserted their popes and summoned a council of the whole Western Church at Pisa to solve the difficulty. To this council there came about 200 bishops, nearly 300 abbots, over 400 doctors of theology, and the representatives of most of the sovereigns of Europe. The primary point to be fought out was whether a council was supreme over a pope, and therefore able to reform errors in the papacy, or whether a pope was above a council. The 6th century would have been amazed that such a question could be debated. the supreme authority in the Church throughout the early centuries having been a general council of equal and independent bishops, each himself under the authority of such a council. But since then, one bishop had exalted himself step by step until the time had come that such a question could be debated. However, the council, by the mere fact of assembling on its own authority, and in defiance of two popes, virtually declared itself the highest power in the Church. Moreover, it at once proceeded formally to lay down the same, and this done, it deposed both the rival popes for their crimes. Then the council made the mistake which nullified all its work. Instead of proceeding to reform the abuses in the Church, and only after this had been done electing a fresh pope, it elected a pope, Alexander V, before attempting to carry out reforms. The natural result followed. Alexander V promptly found means to adjourn the council, nominally for 3 years, practically for an indefinite period. This futile conclusion of the first attempt to reform the Church left matters worse than before. The two deposed popes refused to accept the sentence of the council, so that the only result was that there were now 3 rival popes instead of 2. And so the great schism continued. Florence, for allowing that detested thing, a council, to assemble in one of her subject cities, was, on behalf of one of the 3 popes, Gregory XII, attacked by King Ladislas of Naples, and while the council was sitting, had to protect its deliberations and her own territory by force of arms, with the result that the Florentine army captured Rome. In 1410, Pope Alexander V died, and was succeeded by Pope John XXIII, and in the same year Sigismund, King of Bohemia, the younger brother of Wenceslaus, was elected emperor. In 1413 in England, Henry IV died, and was succeeded by his brilliant son Henry V, and in 1415 the latter invaded France, because that country would not give him Catherine, the king's 3rd daughter, and with her Normandy, Maine, and Anjou. Then followed the great Battle of Agincourt, with its crushing defeat for France. In the same year as this great battle between France and England, there took place the Council of Constance, the second attempt to reform the Church. This council was summoned by the Emperor Sigismund, that holder of the imperial dignity, whom Carlyle sarcastically calls Sigismund super grammaticam. The widely representative and authoritative character of this council may be judged by the list of those who composed it. It included 27 archbishops, 300 bishops, 20 cardinals, 300 abbots and doctors of theology, and 14 deputies of various universities, while there also attended its deliberations 26 princes, 140 counts, and about 4,000 priests. It sat for over 3 years at Constance, whose chief fame it has made. It was purposely held out of Italy, whose bishops could not be depended upon to give an independent opinion. And since these latter outnumbered those of all other countries put together, it was ruled that to prevent their having an undue preponderance, the voting should be by nations. This council put an end to the Great Schism, which for more than a generation had been the scandal of Christendom. Having met and appointed the Emperor Sigismund to preside, and having formally declared its authority over all ecclesiastics, the Pope included, it deposed all the 3 rival popes, and this time they were unable to refuse obedience. Pope John XXIII was, in addition, on account of his crimes, imprisoned for 3 years in the castle of Heidelberg. But the council then made the same mistake as that of Pisa, and before proceeding to reform the abuses in the Church, elected a fresh pope, Martin V. He at once used all his power to prevent any real reforms being passed, concluded separate concordats with each national party, and terminated the council as soon as possible. And so this council, like the former one, failed to achieve that reformation of the Church which all good men throughout Europe desired. One other thing this council did which has brought upon it and the Emperor Sigismund lasting infamy. This was the burning of John Huss and Jerome of Prague for teaching the opinions of Wycliffe in Bohemia, and notwithstanding that they were at the council under the Emperor's own written safe conduct. The disgraceful and only too well-known argument was employed, here perhaps for the first time, that faith need not be kept with those who were heretics. Sigismund thus dishonoured his word, because he feared that otherwise the council, to bring about which he had laboured earnestly, would break up. They were burnt at Constance, 1416, with every circumstance of odious cruelty, and all else achieved by this council is forever blackened by this detestable deed. This action provoked such indignation in Bohemia that it caused a furious war, in which priests were burnt in pitch, whole towns destroyed, commerce ruined, the death of King Wenceslaus caused, and the Emperor Sigismund 3 times defeated and finally driven out of the country. These years, 1400 to 1418, are also those of the extensive conquests made by Florence's powerful rival, Venice. Between 1400 and 1414, Venice conquered Verona, Padua, Vicenza, Belluno, and Feltre, also Lepanto and Patras, also Guastalla, Castelmaggiore, and Brescello. In 1416, Venice gained a great naval victory over the Turkish fleet at Gallipoli, and in the next few years subdued all the towns on the Dalmatian coast, besides waging successful war against Hungary. Venice was at this time at the height of her glory, growing richer and more powerful every year, with annual exports valued at 10 million ducats, while the wealth and magnificence of her governing class was unbounded. Art, 1400 to 1418. Meanwhile, Florence was in these years laying the basis of a very different kind of glory, the results of which were to be of much more permanent importance to the world at large. And this wondrous morning of the Renaissance in art, which shone forth in his time, and with which he was intimately connected, must ever be the main interest in looking at the life of this first of the Medici, especially since, owing to his retiring disposition, we only see occasional glimpses of him among events at that time forming all the principal life of Florence. The 15th century started from the very beginning on its wonderful career in this respect. In the first year of the new century occurred that event already mentioned, the competition for the execution of the bronze doors of the Baptistery. The work, being a votive offering on the part of the entire city, was intended to be of the very best description, for which reason this competition to determine by whom it should be executed was instituted among artists of every country. The subject fixed was a bronze panel representing the sacrifice of Isaac. It is impossible to describe the rivalry and enthusiasm called forth by this competition. It was a time when the stirrings of art were felt throughout the entire population of Florence, and the excitement over the matter was intense. When the models were sent in, 3 of them were considered superior to all others. Those of Ghiberti, Brunelleschi, and Jacopo della Quercia, the 2 former being Florentines and the 3rd a native of Siena. They were all quite young men, Jacopo della Quercia being 27, Ghiberti 23, and Brunelleschi 22. After further consultation, the panel by Ghiberti was judged the best, and the construction of the bronze doors was given to him. The models by Ghiberti and Brunelleschi are preserved in the Museum of the Bargello, and there is no doubt that the decision of the judges was correct. Brunelleschi, in disgust, went off to Rome, declaring that he would learn in which Ghiberti should not be able to excel him. This he did, and became the great architect of his time. Ghiberti 1. Ghiberti began his work at once, and was occupied on the first pair of doors, which represent scenes in the life of Christ, for the next 22 years. The labour expended on this work, which was more perfect than anything seen in art up to that time, and which to this day has never been surpassed, was incalculable. Again and again the panels were recast, Ghiberti always striving after something more perfect, and his patience and determination being so great that he again and again destroyed the results he achieved, being resolved not to desist from his labours until he attained the ideal after which he strove. And very wonderful was the aim which he set before himself. In Ghiberti's hands, bronze reliefs became in reality pictures in bronze, even the clouds being represented, and the effect of distance being marvellously rendered. Ghiberti himself tells us, and what he says, while simple enough to us all now, is most interesting when we remember that this is in the early days of art, as follows. In modelling these reliefs, I strove to imitate nature to the utmost. I sought to understand how forms strike upon the eye, and how the theoretical part of sculptural and pictorial art should be managed. Working with the utmost care and diligence, I introduced into some of my panels as many as 100 figures. These I modelled upon different planes, so that those nearest to the eye might appear larger, and those more remote smaller in proportion. As this work proceeded, its influence on art in general was extraordinary. Ghiberti had to employ a number of assistants, and these pictures in bronze, with their lifelike figures and excellent relief, became, as the details of their execution were followed out, a perfect school of art, in which all who had either the sculptor's or the painter's instinct learnt valuable lessons. Besides the effect thus produced on the art world generally, 2 at least of the assistants employed by Ghiberti in this work learnt therein that which enabled them afterwards to attain fame exceeding even his: the painter Masaccio and the sculptor Donatello. Then followed in 1412, while the above work was still in progress, another event, likewise contributing to help forward the outburst in art. This was the completion by the Guild of the Wool Merchants of their church of Or San Michele, and the decision to adorn the outside of the walls with statues of apostles and saints, each statue to be given by one of the principal guilds. Hence fresh emulation, each guild desiring its statue to be the finest, and all the best sculptors vying with each other in the production of these statues. Or San Michele thus becoming another centre of art inspiration. In this way there were produced during the next few years, in 1412, Donatello's statue of St. Peter, in 1413, Donatello's statue of St. Mark, in 1414, Ghiberti's statue of St. John the Baptist, In 1415, Ghiberti's statue of St. Stephen. In 1416, Donatello's celebrated statue of St. George. In 1418, Ghiberti's statue of St. Matthew. Statues by other masters followed in subsequent years. Life in Florence in Giovanni's day was a very different thing from that which it became 2 generations later. Anything in the direction of luxury was condemned by plain-living Florence as a sign of degeneracy, and when Giovanni, in order to give assistance to struggling artists, had the whole of the walls of his house decorated with frescoes, a form of decoration hitherto confined to churches, we may be sure that this action was looked upon by many as a questionable innovation, betokening a reprehensible tendency to voluptuousness. For very austere indeed was the style of living then customary. The palaces of even the most wealthy were furnished with a plainness which scorned all idea of either beauty or comfort. Heavy tables and straight-backed wooden chairs covered with leather, bare stone floors, desperately cold in winter, whitewashed walls, only covered with tapestry on state occasions, a huge credenza containing vases, glass, majolica and silver for use at banquets, wide, hard, comfortless beds, and great chests containing linen and clothes. Such were the surroundings, and such the only furniture considered necessary, even in the palaces of the noblest families. As to dress, there was the same austerity, and here Florence enacted very strict laws to check undue extravagance. These laws laid down with the most minute exactness what a lady's dress might be like, and what it might not be like, and the same as regards the men. No lady might have her dress made of other material, nor of greater length or breadth than was laid down, nor wear any of numerous forbidden ornaments. While for the men was prescribed, for all above the class of artisans, the plain garment, buttoned straight down the front and looking like a priest's cassock, which is to be seen in all the earlier portraits in this book. We do not hear much about the ladies of this period. It was not until a generation or 2 later that they began to come forth from the seclusion considered correct in Giovanni's time, but they evidently fought vigorously against these laws about dress. They evaded them in numberless ingenious ways, and waged an untiring warfare with the authorities on the subject. In this contest, which went on perpetually between the ladies and the officials charged with seeing that these sumptuary laws were obeyed, for which thorny task foreigners, i.e. non-Florentines, were purposely appointed, the officers concerned had evidently no pleasant time. One of them reports as follows: "When, obeying the orders ye gave me, I went out to seek for the forbidden ornaments of your women, they met me with arguments such as are not to be found in any book of laws. There cometh a woman with the peak of her hood fringed out and twined around her head. My notary saith, Tell me your name, for you have a peak with fringes. Then the good woman taketh this peak, which is fastened round her hood with a pin, and holding it in her hand, she declareth that it is a wreath. Then going further, he findeth one wearing many buttons in front of her dress, and he saith unto her, Ye are not allowed to wear these buttons. But she answers, These are not buttons, but studs, and if ye do not believe me, look, they have no loops, and moreover there are no buttonholes. Then my notary goeth to another who is wearing ermine, and saith, Now, what can she say to this? Ye are wearing ermine. And he prepares to write down her name. But the woman answers, Do not write me down, for this is not ermine, it is the fur of a suckling. Saith the notary, "What is this suckling?" And the woman replies, "It is an animal." No wonder that the authorities remark, "We do but knock our heads against a wall," and that in the next generation these sumptuary laws were gradually allowed to become a dead letter, the ladies having gained the victory. In 1418 we hear of Giovanni giving a large sum of money to assist one whose deservedly incurred misfortunes, we are told, roused his pity. In conjunction with the chief of the party of the nobles, Niccolò da Uzzano, he obtained after strong efforts the release of the deposed and imprisoned Pope John XXIII, on condition that a ransom of 38,000 ducats should be paid, and the whole of this sum Giovanni himself gave. Pope John, on being released, came, broken down and destitute, to Florence, and was given an asylum there by Giovanni, who, when the deposed pope died in the following year, erected to his memory the beautiful monument which is to be seen in the baptistery. In 1419 we find Giovanni at his own cost erecting and endowing an important charitable institution which remains to the present day, the Foundling Hospital of Florence, the Ospedale degli Innocenti, and in carrying out this charitable work he also managed to help forward the cause of art. Brunelleschi had by this time returned to Florence, having in the intervening years carried out his determination to learn another branch of art, in which Ghiberti should not be able to rival him, but he had not yet obtained any opportunity of displaying his powers. Giovanni gave him this opportunity by entrusting the construction of his new hospital to him. Though afterwards eclipsed by his other achievements, the Foundling Hospital remains notable as being the great architect's first prominent work. In 1421 Giovanni received the highest mark of esteem which his country could confer. In spite of the opposition of the nobles, who urged that it was unsafe to allow one so wealthy and so popular to hold that office, he was, without any seeking for it on his part, elected Gonfaloniere. In 1422 Florence entered on a 4 years' war with Milan, whose duke, Filippo Maria Visconti, the cowardly and treacherous son of Gian Galeazzo, was threatening to absorb all northern Italy. Giovanni de Bicci was against this war, feeling that Florence was not strong enough for it and could not afford the cost. And in it Florence suffered no less than 6 serious defeats within a space of about 2 years. Nevertheless, she gained in the end the object for which she fought. After 4 years of war, Venice joined her against Milan, with the eventual result that the designs of the Duke of Milan were frustrated, and he was forced to conclude a peace, the terms of which were honourable to Florence. Thus, twice during 25 years had Florence stood in the breach and prevented 2 successive Dukes of Milan from subduing all Italy. These 2 wars are said to have cost Florence a sum equal in our present money to £6 million sterling. In 1426 Giovanni succeeded in effecting, in spite of every kind of opposition from the nobles, the chief political measure of his life. This was his celebrated catasto, the new form of taxation devised by him. The main tax on the people had hitherto been an irregular poll tax, which bore very unfairly upon them, and gave unlimited opportunities to the nobles to exercise oppression. It was consequently hated by the people. Giovanni worked out a scheme to substitute for this a fixed tax on property, which would be regular in its incidence and prevent the nobles from evading their due share of the general taxation, and by his weight and influence in the Signoria, succeeded in getting this measure passed. And this, notwithstanding that it increased very largely the amount he would himself have to pay. The nobles were, of course, furious and accused him of all sorts of ulterior motives, but Giovanni, having no such motives, went on his way undisturbed, and for this immense boon which he had procured for them, the people looked on him as their saviour and benefactor, and were ready to do anything for one who had fought thus strenuously on their behalf. In 1427, Giovanni performed his last act as a champion of the cause of the poorer classes. A number of the nobles, headed by Rinaldo degli Albizzi and Niccolo d'Auzzano, held a secret meeting to devise means for reducing the power of the people in the government. The plan they eventually settled upon was to put forward a suggestion to the Signoria to reduce the number of the inferior guilds, and also to remove the prohibition against members of the nobili being eligible for election to the Signoria, using the argument that the time had passed when such a prohibition was necessary. Having elaborated the details of their plan, the nobili on a suitable occasion submitted their suggestion to the Signoria for discussion. The proposal, in the manner in which it was put forward, was a specious one, while its real object was kept carefully veiled. But Giovanni, ever on the watch to defend the cause of the people, fathomed its real intention. He exerted the whole weight of his influence to oppose the measure, and entirely through his vigorous opposition it was defeated. By this, the last act of his public life, he increased still more his popularity with the people. The wrath of the nobles was proportionate, and all the more so since they could not openly show it, without disclosing to all what their object had been. Giovanni on this occasion showed the sagacity to detect, the courage to oppose, and the sound judgment to foil without an open conflict a dangerous attempt to revolutionize the government. Contemporary historical events, 1418 to 1428. The chief events outside Italy during these years were the following. In 1420, Henry V of England, having by this time conquered all France north of the Loire, the Treaty of Troyes was executed. By this treaty, the crown of France was secured to him, to the exclusion of the Dauphin Charles, whenever the mad king, Charles VI, should die, and meanwhile Henry was made regent of France and at last married to the French king's daughter, Catherine. In 1422, Charles VI and Henry V both died, and the latter was succeeded by his 6-month-old son, Henry VI, the Earl of Bedford being appointed regent of France on his behalf during his minority. In 1425, the Emperor Manuel Palaeologus died, and his son, John Palaeologus, John VII, succeeded him as Emperor of the Eastern Empire, by this time reduced to little more than its capital city, Constantinople. In 1428, the regent Bedford, having gained several victories over the Dauphin Charles, crossed the Loire and began his memorable siege of Orléans, the key to the south of France. Art, 1418 to 1428. The years 1418 to 1428 were years of still further developments in that outburst of new life in the world of art taking place in Florence. In the year 1418, the cathedral, begun by Arnolfo di Cambio 120 years before, and which when finished would be the largest then existing, was approaching completion. But it still wanted its dome, and all concerned were in despair as to how a dome was ever to be thrown over so vast a space. At length Brunelleschi, who was then building the Foundling Hospital, came forward and offered to do it, but would not say how. There was great opposition to giving the task to him, and the reason is important as showing the conditions from which art had gradually to emancipate itself. Every citizen of Florence who aspired either to have any political rights or to take any part in the important public works from time to time being executed had to belong to one or other of the 21 guilds. The 7 major guilds were 1. Wool merchants, 2. Dyers of foreign cloth, 3. Silk merchants, 4. Furriers, 5. Bankers, 6. Judges and lawyers, and 7. Doctors and apothecaries. There was no special guild for the workers in art. The painters had to belong to the guild of apothecaries, the architects and sculptors either to the guild of the wool merchants or to that of the silk merchants. The 14 minor guilds were simply those of the various trades and had lesser privileges. Brunelleschi. 1. Up to the time when Brunelleschi made the above refusal to announce his plans, every great public work such as this was done collectively under the auspices of some particular guild, and anything like independent working in such matters was unprecedented. And the whole work of erecting the cathedral was carried out by a board of works, acting under the orders of the Guild of the Wool Merchants. Brunelleschi, being of an independent character, detested this system, which hampered all artists much, but especially architects. Since his disappointment over the bronze doors, he had spent nearly 20 years in studying architecture, more especially the ancient buildings at Rome, and was now confident that he knew a way of building the great dome and without using any scaffolding, this point being the chief difficulty. But if he succeeded in building it, he desired that it should be his, and not that of the Board of Works, and did not want to tell his secret only to have it appropriated by a corporate body, who might also modify his designs. But this was just what the board wished to be able to do. Such novel independence was, in their opinion, most objectionable and required putting down. And so there was a tremendous contest. However, eventually Brunelleschi prevailed, simply because all knew by this time that he was the only man who could construct the dome. The work was given to him, and the construction began in 1420. And though even after this there were constant battles, still, by degrees, the great dome slowly rose on his designs and under his superintendence. It was built without any scaffolding, and on a principle Brunelleschi had learnt from studying the roof of the Pantheon at Rome. He tells us that managing while at Rome to get on the roof of the Pantheon and to take off some of the outer stones, so as to inspect the ribbing of the vault, and discovering the way the blocks of stone were dovetailed into one another so as to be almost self-supporting, this gave him his ideas for the dome of Florence, while it also led him to conceive how to utilize crossbeams to gird the ribs together, and how a second dome within the first would strengthen the whole. The dome is built on this principle, one dome within the other, and the two bound together so as to support each other, with a space between sufficient for a staircase, and each dome resting on a drum. It was the first of the kind ever constructed, was considered the wonder of the age, and is the largest double cupola in Europe. Domes had, of course, been a feature of Byzantine architecture, but the great change made by the Renaissance was that caused by lifting the dome on a drum, the dome thus becoming the chief feature of the building. It is interesting to notice how, as it had been with learning, and as it had been with sculpture, so here again with architecture we have a resurrection of the long past, and Brunelleschi receives his inspiration from the Pantheon, built by the Emperor Hadrian 1300 years before. In 1425, Giovanni di Bicci gave a commission to Brunelleschi which resulted in one of the three chief works for which the latter has obtained fame, the Church of San Lorenzo, now so famous on account of its tombs of the Medici family. This church, one of the most ancient in Italy, having been consecrated by St. Ambrose himself in AD 393, was in 1423 falling into ruins. Giovanni now undertook to rebuild it, devoting thereto a large amount of his fortune, and after his time it was, when completed, endowed by his descendants, and became the family church of the Medici. On this church Brunelleschi lavished all his talent, and it is one of his finest creations. Symonds, speaking of it, says, quote, "Not a form or detail in the whole church is at variance with classic precedent, and yet the general effect resembles nothing that we possess of antique work. It is a masterpiece of intelligent Renaissance adaptation." Unquote. Following as he did the sobriety and correctness of the classic style, the keynote of which is harmony, Brunelleschi's buildings are remarkable for this latter characteristic. They never give one that jar which, like a discordant note in music, is produced by a falsity in architecture, and whose effect we feel, even though perhaps unable to point out wherein it lies. His churches of San Lorenzo and Santo Spirito are both of them examples of this characteristic of harmony, and to it is undoubtedly due their indescribably peaceful effect. Ghiberti 2. In 1424, the first pair of bronze doors, on which Ghiberti had so long been at work, were at last finished. They had taken him 22 years. The enthusiasm when they were set up was tremendous. Nothing like this in art had been seen before. All Florence crowded to see them, and the Signoria, who never quitted the Palazzo della Signoria in a body, except on the greatest occasions, came in state to applaud the work and do honour to the artist. When we think of all that this work had called forth in every branch of art during the long years he had been employed on it, of the genius which had created this wonderful new departure, and of the determined perseverance by which alone the work was brought to such perfection, we are led to feel that Ghiberti deserved any honour which his countrymen and their governing body could confer upon him. Ghiberti, by this time a man of 45, at once set to work on his second pair of doors, which were destined to take him still longer and to surpass even the first pair in excellence. Masocchio. In 1423, 7 years after Donatello had produced his statue of St. George, 3 years after Brunelleschi had begun to construct his dome, and 1 year before Ghiberti finished his first pair of bronze doors, painting showed that same new burst of life which had already been shown by architecture and sculpture. For in that year Masaccio, afterwards so famous and destined to advance the art of painting by so immense a step that he became the leader of all painters after him, began his frescoes in the Brancacci chapel of the Church of the Carmelites, the Carmine. The influence of Ghiberti's work of the bronze doors is, in the case of Masaccio, directly traceable. Born in the year of the competition of 1401, he worked as a boy under Ghiberti on the panels of these doors, and there learnt the knowledge of form, effect of light and shade, and other secrets, which he afterwards elaborated in his paintings. In these, by a proper use of light and shade, he gave roundness to the limbs, was the first to give to figures natural attitudes and a lifelike appearance, and to drapery natural folds, improved the drawing of heads and hands, and, as Vasari says, improved everything. But this was not recognised until after his short life had ended. He was crushed with poverty, burdened with the maintenance of younger brothers, always ready to do a good turn to others but careless about his own affairs, and entirely absorbed in his painting, was almost unknown. Dying at the age of 27, only 4 years after he began painting these frescoes, his life was so short, and he was so hampered by debt, that he has left very few works. Except for 2 small, unimportant pictures at Berlin, and one in the Accademia at Florence, no picture of Masaccio's is in any of the galleries of Europe, and all his fame rests on the frescoed walls of one small chapel in Florence. Nevertheless, with him, painting entered on a new epoch, and the Brancacci chapel has become sacred ground to all painters, since there almost all the great masters after him, including, Vasari tells us, Perugino, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, Andrea del Sarto, Fra Bartolomeo, and many of lesser genius, have studied and copied the works of one who is the inaugurator of all that we understand by modern painting. In this chapel wrought one of the few, nature's interpreters, the few whom genius gives as lights to shine, Masaccio. Look around, and know that where we stand stood oft and long, oft till the day was gone, Raphael himself. Nor he alone so great the ardour there, such while it reigned the generous rivalry. He and how many more, once thither drawn, anxious to learn of those who came before, to steal a spark from their immortal fire, who first did break the universal gloom, sons of the morning. Rogers, Italy. Giovanni di Bicci, in his readiness to befriend struggling artists, assisted the poor youth who was then so little known, and Masaccio introduced a portrait of him into his fresco picture of the consecration of the Carmine Church in 1422, but this fresco was destroyed when the greater part of that church was burnt in 1721. At some time during the year 1427, Masaccio ended his painting for the Carmelite community and went off to Rome. None know for what purpose, for of such an insignificant person nothing was at that time recorded, but presumably in order to obtain work. And there in the following year he died in poverty and obscurity, unknown to fame until after he was dead, when the world awoke to the knowledge of what a genius had been living in that obscure corner of Florence where he had worked. Giovanni di Bicci, 1428. Giovanni died in 1428 at the age of 68, and at his death left an immense fortune to his 2 sons, Cosimo and Lorenzo. He died deservedly esteemed by his countrymen, beloved by the humbler classes of the people, who had so often found in him a defender, and whose welfare he had consistently promoted, remembered with gratitude by all who, struggling to rise in some branch of art, had never failed to receive from him a helping hand, and respected even by some amongst the nobili, who, though always opposed by him, had never found him other than an honourable antagonist. Machiavelli, describing his character, says, "He never sought the honours of government, yet enjoyed them all. When holding high office, he was courteous to all. Not a man of great eloquence, but of an extraordinary prudence." Giovanni had assisted at the birth of the movement in which Ghiberti, Brunelleschi, Donatello and Masaccio were the leaders. He had helped its onward course, and he died as its morning ended with the death of Masaccio and began to pass into full noon. Thus the chief interest connected with his life will always be that memorable outburst in art which took place between the years 1400 and 1428, burning with such ardour among the Florentines that it threw even politics into the background, and formed the prominent feature in the life of Florence during his time. He lies buried with Piccarda, his wife, in the old sacristy, in the church of San Lorenzo, the only portion of the rebuilt church which was finished at the time of his death. Their fine tomb, richly ornamented with figures of butti and garlands of flowers, stands in the centre of the sacristy, with a large marble table over it. The tomb is interesting from the fact that isolated tombs like this, though common in other countries, were very rare in Italy. Such was the founder of this family, which was destined to have so momentous a history. He laid the foundations of the family solidly, not so much by the popularity which he won through his steadfast championship of the cause of the humbler classes, as by the principles of magnanimity, generosity, courtesy, and care for the people, which he taught his sons, and caused to become an unwritten law in this family for 3 generations after him. As we look at the kindly and sensible old face in his portrait, we feel how well it was for Florence in after years that Giovanni di Bicci de Medici possessed the character that he did. It will be seen how, on his death, the party of the nobles took steps to destroy his work, as well as to prevent these upstart Medici from rising any higher.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.